Around the world on Christmas Eve, children are tucked into their beds and drift into an excited slumber, knowing that while they sleep, in the middle of the night, a big, bearded man in a red coat is going to land on their roof and invade their home. In fact, Christmas might be the one night of the year when a home invasion isn't just expected, it's welcomed. That's because the man in the red coat isn't here to harm us, he's here to leave us gifts. But what if that wasn't the case? What if children aren't as safe at Christmas as they think? In 1989, French director René Mansour made a strange horror film called Deadly Games. It was a queasy mix of home invasion horror, 80s fantasy, and Rambo-style action, with a story about a boy protecting his home from a psychopathic, predatory Santa Claus on Christmas Eve. The following year, 20th Century Fox released an American family Christmas movie. It was written by John Hughes and directed by Chris Columbus, and it went on to gross over $400 million, making it one of the most successful and beloved Christmas movies ever made.
You guys give up, or you're thirsty for more?
However, this family-friendly classic bore several striking similarities to 1989's Deadly Games. So much so that director René Mansour threatened legal action on the grounds of plagiarism, alleging that Home Alone, this family-friendly classic, was actually an unauthorized remake of his gritty, disturbing cult horror film. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss a cult classic and a Christmas classic with Deadly Games and Home Alone.
Keep the change, you filthy animal.
Merry Christmas. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munter, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th season exploring the evolution of home invasion, and this is episode 18. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we've got a fun, quite different mix of movies to usual. We're going to be talking about the weird little cult classic Deadly Games from 1989, aka Game Over, aka Hide and Freak, aka 3615 Code Father Christmas, and that's going to be paired with Home Alone from 1990, the classic home invasion masterpiece. So, both of these discussions will of course be spoilerific. Give yourself a little Christmas treat here in the middle of August and check both films out before you listen to our discussion. I'm so ready for this conversation. The log fire is burning, the Christmas carols are on in the background, and I've got a glass of eggnog. I just need my guest to turn up and then we're ready to go. Joining me to discuss these two bangers, I've got a long-time friend of the pod. In fact, he's been here with me on the podcast since the very, very beginning. As well as being a TV producer, he is also the host and creator of the Icelandic cinema podcast Kvik Mindapod. And I'm assuming this must be him. It's the one and only Rob Watts.
Happy birthday, Christmas.
Rob?
Welcome, holy Jesus.
That was lovely.
Hi, Mike.
This is lovely, Rob. I've never had a guest turn up and do carol singing before. Come on in out of the cold. Take a seat. How are you, Rob?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good. Did you ever do any Christmas caroling back in the day when you were a child, Rob?
I never did, you know. It wasn't that big in our area. I wasn't like in the church or anything, so never got to do it. I did like singing carols, though.
Christmas caroling is a weird thing. I always found it quite weird. Like, even when Christmas carolers came to my door, I was like, what am I supposed to do? What are you supposed to do here? Just kind of like stand there awkwardly and watch them, right?
Well, yeah, it's like half as awkward as like a person about to barge into your house. Like,
yeah.
Is it? tangentially home invasion, I suppose. Like, I don't want to stand in my doorway cringing at you for 10 minutes or something.
It's actually pretty cheeky, isn't it? And then you've got to give them money to get rid of them, basically, right?
Yeah. Very odd.
Yeah.
I suppose you could not open the door.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Which I think my parents used to do sometimes. I think they were like, no, don't answer it. It's basically like Jehovah's Witnesses, but they ask for money as well. So it's like, nightmare.
No thanks. Please leave.
No thanks. God. So speaking of home invasion, Rob, we are obviously talking about two iconic home invasion movies today. Iconic. But let me ask you about this subgenre, which is one that definitely divides people. What do you think of home invasion movies generally? I
am a fan. A big fan, to be honest with you. I think I tend to find them far more scary than sort of other genres. I love... For me, like, they are genuinely terrifying. I think they've got high stakes. It's personal. They're kind of super claustrophobic because you're only in your home. I mean, some houses are bigger than others, but it's still, a smaller space. Yeah. When you announced it as a theme for this series, I was like, oh, actually, this is probably my favourite subgenre. Like, then I started counting like how many of my favourite films of recent years are like home invasion films, and like I can read off a list. I don't think you're soon to be covering most of these, I'm sure, but like films like Hard Candy, Knock Knock, Don't Breathe, You're Next, Funny Games. You know, I didn't realize I own most of these. That's a little subgenre that I have a collection of far more than I have, the rest of the ones we've covered on the series. So yeah, big fan.
That's really interesting, isn't it? And I think it's definitely, especially for our generation, we've talked a lot together about kind of horror movies of the 2000s when we were growing up. And it definitely, home invasion became such a big subgenre around that time, didn't it? The time that we were kind of getting into horror. I think of home invasion movies, the first thing I think of are those kind of like grisly, grimy horror movies of the 2000s, basically,
Yeah, well, we know there's a reason for that. 9/11 and everything. And I guess, these are kind of a precursor to those, especially with the kind of booby traps that we've got here. We've covered all those Saw movies.
Oh my God, yeah.
Are these like proto Saw?
Right. I mean, Saw definitely has elements of these types of movies, doesn't it, I think? Yeah, definitely. And why do you think it is, like so many people, you mentioned there, it's kind of one of the subgenres that scares you. Why do you think it is for so many people the scariest subgenre?
Well, I'm sure I'm repeating what, other people have said here already, but like, home is supposed to be that safe space. It's the one place that we should know we can rely on to be safe. It's where we are at home. It's where we do our most vulnerable things, sleep most specifically. So someone coming into that space with an ulterior motive, a negative or dangerous motive it's just the worst. I know, but I think Home Alone may have set me up for kind of being okay with it, in the fact that I reckon I could probably defend myself.
Really?
Which is a strange thing to say off the back of like a comic kids Christmas film. But yeah, like in real life, I think I'm okay. But on screen, like just give me all the kind of torture, the murder, whatever it is, just someone getting into that place where a person feels most secure. It's just a horrible thought, isn't it?
It really is. And it does definitely, it turns even the invadees into monsters too, right? Like the violence that, on both sides of a scenario like that, right, is always interesting.
Yeah. And it's normally, I suppose you'd probably cover, if it was an alien coming into the house, that I guess wouldn't be here in this series. It's always, or almost always, another person.
Yes.
And that, that's what grounds it in reality. This can happen. Most of what, it might be a sort of heightened version of reality, but home invasion is like the most legit thing that could happen to any of us.
Exactly that, right? It's like the most human of human horrors, it feels like, I think. Yeah, for sure. Have you ever experienced anything of that yourself? Have you ever had a break-in of any kind or anything like that?
I don't think I have. I was trying to rack my brains. I feel like I would remember like a proper home invasion experience. I haven't. I do remember though, when I was like at I don't know, 10 or something at school, someone or some people tried to steal the bikes from our shed in the garden. And the neighbours heard them. They flashed their bedroom lights and these guys ran away. The police came round, took statements, and obviously they hadn't taken anything, so it wasn't really the end of the world or anything. But, you know, I slept through the entire thing. I don't know if that's kind of good or bad. You know, if it was much worse, if they'd made it into the house and wanted more than just to steal stuff, I guess I'd probably be quite useless and die before I woke up.
Yeah, I know. Do you I know, like, do you ever have like a plan in your head of like, what would you do? Where would you escape out of? Or what would you use as a weapon or anything like that?
It's funny, I don't tend to think about that like when I'm going to bed or anything, but sometimes if I'm home alone, I will like look at take a glance around the room and see what I could use. Just like, I don't have a baseball bat, but I must have something that I can do similar damage with.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
You hear a strange noise in the back, and, you know, the sliding doors to the garden are they're always closed. Of course they're closed. But if they're not, then I need something. Tennis racket, that might do some damage. I don't know.
Yeah, we need. This is where we fall down, unlike Americans who, you know, all have guns in their bedside drawers. You know, we don't have that here.
Yes, Americans bringing in that the danger is already there, that they've already got a gun as well. Like
exactly that. The danger's already very much in the home there. So we've got two very Christmassy movies as well, and this is interesting. I mean, like, it's the middle of July, Christmas in July. Why not? There's Christmas. Like, before we get into these movies generally, I feel like Christmas does seem like it's quite a popular season for horror, doesn't it? Like, there's always been this kind of Christmas horror tradition, it feels like. Why do you think that is? Why does Christmas go hand in hand so well with horror?
You know, I've been thinking about this too. I'm not 100% sure. I think everyone loves a Christmas something.
Yes.
You know, whether it's a Christmas song or a Christmas episode of your favourite sitcom or whatever.
Yeah.
So naturally you're going to get a Christmas version of a horror film.
Yeah.
But I reckon the darkness of Christmas, you know, it's winter, that's a scarier time. But the colours of Christmas and the fact that it's supposed to be a happy time, perhaps that invites horror as being like amplified.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. There is something kind of, like, I don't know, eerie about a kind of house. Like you said, there's a darkness, there's a quietness about Christmas sometimes, I think. Like, I think of snow and I think of like muffled sound and I think of like twinkling Christmas lights, and good horror films can use those sorts of things to their advantage, I think, can't they? For sure.
Yeah, it's those images that you don't see at any other time of the year that you can put a sinister twist on.
We talked about this a lot in our Ghost Stories series, but, you know, it was such a tradition, obviously, at Christmas with telling ghost stories, Christmas ghost stories for, you know, from the BBC, you know, blah, blah, blah. It's always been a tradition. And, you know, there's that feeling of, you know, back in the day, before we had television in the winter months, what did people do? They would sit around and tell each other stories around a fireplace or whatever, true. I guess. And it gives you that kind of atmosphere, I think, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and it works so well for home invasion as well, because this is supposed to be the happiest time of the year.
Yes.
And to break through that safe and supposedly extremely happy kind of shell, just works brilliantly.
Actually, yeah, and I suppose particularly the home, like, at Christmas, everyone is at home, basically. Like, that's what you associate with Christmas, right? For the most part, those of us who are lucky enough to have a home and a family, we mostly go home to our families, right? And I guess that's the other thing, is that, you know, you get these movies. I mean, I guess really Santa Claus is the ultimate home invader, Rob. He enters all of our homes every single year on an annual basis. You know, like, that in itself could be quite creepy the more you think about it.
Oh, 100%. I think the Nightmare Before Christmas shows you that. Like, creepy Santa coming absolutely wrecks the joint. No, everyone's terrified. Like, what a perfect kind of encapsulation of what a terrible Santa could be. I mean, we've got another example of it today.
Yes. All right. Well, that's a perfect segue in. Let's do it, shall we? Let's begin our deep dives and start discussing Deadly Games from 1989.
December 24th, midnight. hidden under the dining room table, Thomas waits for Father Christmas. But what he does not know is that he is about to experience the most frightening night in his entire life.
It's called Deadly Games in the UK, but it's actually got like 100 names. This movie.
Please read them all out.
So it's Deadly Games, also known as Dial Code Santa Claus, also known as Game Over, as Hide and Freak, and 3615 Code Father Christmas.
Brilliant.
As well.
Yeah. Which film are we talking about?
Love it.
And we of course get the most generic title as well. So
yes,
even trying to find this film to watch it, I was like sifting through a few examples, like which one is it actually?
Yeah, I agree. Because there are other less good films out there called Deadly Games as well, so it's easy to get them confused. But yes, we are going to talk about Deadly Games from 1989. Rob, start us off. Give us a little plot breakdown of Deadly Games.
Okay, so 8-year-old Thomas lives in a huge mansion with his mum and grandpa, aka Pappy. On Christmas Eve, his mother heads to work as manager of a department store, leaving Thomas to his own devices and to take care of his diabetic and almost blind Pappy. Meanwhile, a strange man with a rather childlike demeanour gets rejected first from a kid's snowball fight and then by a younger girl when he's acting as a Santa. This really riles him up, and so he heads over to Thomas's mansion, having earlier pretended to be Father Christmas to Thomas over a very French messaging service, where he kills a few people and a dog, engages in a deadly game of hide and seek with Thomas and his Pappy, and is subjected to a whole bunch of booby traps.
Indeed. So, Rob, what did you think of this film? Was this the first time you had seen it for the podcast?
It was, yeah. First time I'd ever heard of it.
Yeah.
And I absolutely loved it.
Yes.
I'm hoping you did too, because
I loved it. I really loved it. Like, exactly the same as you. I was not aware of this film. I think it was Kevin Lyons who recommended it to me, because I sort of said, half jokingly, that, you know, when I was planning this series, that wouldn't it be great to do Home Alone as the ultimate home invasion movie as part of the lineup? And Kevin Lyons was like, if you're doing Home Alone, you've got to do Deadly Games, which is basically the horror version of Home Alone, which came, you know, just 1 year earlier. So he kind of introduced that film to me, and I sought it out on Shudder. It's easy to watch, thank God, as well, because you'd think a film like this that is as obscure as this would be more difficult to find. But luckily, it's streaming on Shudder, so that was good. But I absolutely loved it as well. Yeah, what a weird, kind of unique little film this is, right?
Unique is the word, isn't it? It's not. Yeah, it doesn't feel like anything else I've ever seen. It's sort of a mashup of. Yeah, sort of. I know it came before Home Alone, but it's kind of like you've got Home Alone in there. You've got 80s action films in there.
Yeah.
You've got like a really, really sweet film about a boy and his grandpa and the family relationships. And then it's also quite dramatic in its kind of themes as well. And there's this theme of loss of innocence that runs throughout as well, which we'll touch upon in a bit.
Yes.
But it's like a mishmash of everything, and it all just works so brilliantly. I don't know how.
Yeah, it's a really weird thing, because you're right. Like, it reminded me a bit of Wes Craven's The People Under the Stairs too, which is coming out which we're covering next week actually, and it has a similar vibe in that it kind of feels like it should be a kids movie almost, but then there's this really, really dark stuff involved in it as well.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, holy shit, this is actually much darker and more disturbing and upsetting than I was expecting it to be, you know, and it does. That kind of puts you in quite an uncomfortable place when you watch it, you know?
It does. Like, it feels a bit like... It feels a little bit fairy tale-like and fantastical.
Yes.
But it is still grounded in reality. And yeah, like, so for so much of the film, we're watching a young boy have a great time running around his enormous house, playing, like, I don't know, war games and Rambo and all of that. And then it just gets so dark.
It really does. It really does. So let's get into it. Let me start off by asking you just about the kind of general look and vibe of this film. That, you know, René Manzor, the director, he wrote and directed this, and it feels like very much authored, like a film authored by a person, right, with a particular vibe. Like, it's got a lot of slow-mo, it's got very particular lighting and kind of colour palette, right? But what do you think generally of kind of the way this film was directed?
It is remarkable. You know, it does feel like I was saying, like those 80s action films, and you were saying slow-mo and montage and kind of soft focus, like there's Vaseline on the lens, and these kind of low angle, I think they used to call them like the top of the pop shot, like those kind of the Evil Dead shots and stuff. And I don't know how he does it, but it all blends so well together. It just feels fantastical. And yeah, I'm no expert, but I think he might have made the perfect Christmas horror film.
Oh, I love this. Yeah, it is. It does feel super Christmassy, that's for sure. And there is something about it. I think, like you mentioned, there's a sort of fairy tale element to it where we'll talk about this a bit as we go, but I was in two minds as to whether or not this was even set in the real world, or if this was some sort of fantasy at some point, or if we're inside this little boy's head in terms of the way he's directed stuff to look so stylized and kind of larger than life, literally larger than life, I think, as well, in terms of the house, right? But yeah, I love that kind of vibe, that he gave it this kind of dark fairy tale vibe throughout. Yeah, and
I guess that makes sense, because this kid is so kind of, he's got so many ideas, he's obviously intelligent, but he still has the childlike wonder and dreams.
Yes.
So it could very well be something that he's thought up. But I don't know. I just loved the way it looked. I never really considered whether it was a fairy tale or a real thing. But yeah. It looks great.
It looks amazing. Yeah, I think it brought to mind, like you mentioned, 80s movies. I mean, definitely Rambo. There's like a Rambo theme throughout, right? In that the character himself is kind of, Thomas is kind of making himself out to look and act like Rambo. And that's the other thing it reminded me of, was Son of Rambo with Will Poulter as well.
Yeah,
like, it's like that. But there is something of those kind of 80s kids films that are really creepy, you know, like Labyrinth and the never-ending story as well, and these things that they also have that kind of vibe where they're almost like dreamt up in the main character's head almost, but also they're really happening to these children as well, but there's something kind of like horrific fairy tale about them, you know? I love that vibe.
Yeah, it's on that line of could be reality, could be fantastical, could be in the head, and like it's so true with things like Labyrinth. You're like, once they leave through that window or whatever it is, where are we now?
Exactly.
And I guess once Father Christmas comes down the chimney here, I mean, I hope in one way I hope that this isn't in Thomas's head, because that would probably mean something awful is going on up there, because this is very nightmarish stuff.
Well, I do love, again, it goes back to that idea that this is something that Christmas films have done. You know, Silent Night, Deadly Night, there's a slasher film from the early 80s that does exactly this, where at the beginning a kind of grandpa tells his grandson and scares the shit out of him with this story of Santa Claus is actually a monster and he comes to punish you in the night and stuff, you know. And I love this idea that this little boy, he's sort of excited / quite scared, I think, at the beginning of kind of waiting up, because his plan is he's going to wait up in the middle of the night, right, and not go to bed, and kind of set cameras up or whatever to try and prove whether or not Santa Claus is real and is actually visiting his home. And of course it turns out that this really horrible deranged man invades his home at this point. But yeah, like, I love this idea that actually, like, is the idea of Santa Claus actually quite creepy when you think about it for kids, and like kids that probably overthink it think, actually, some stranger is entering my room in the middle of the night and leaving me gifts while I sleep. Like, is there something a bit creepy about that? And I love that this film really plays with that idea, you know?
Totally, yeah. Like I say, sleep. I'd rather be asleep. If he's going to come in the house, let me be asleep, leave the presents and piss off.
Yeah. Wait, do you remember when you first discovered, you know, Father Christmas wasn't real? Do you remember what age you were at when you started to suddenly twig, hang on, this is a myth?
I must have been around, I reckon about 9, maybe 10.
Yeah.
A little bit older than Thomas and Kevin in these films. I can't pinpoint it, but I'm sure once I started watching films that kind of played with the idea of Father Christmas, I don't think my parents would have let me see those if I was still believing in Santa, I suppose.
Yeah, I think this film does a really good job of kind of sort of nailing that point, that coming of age moment, right? Where Thomas is 9, 10. He's clearly very, very intelligent. He sort of still does believe in Father Christmas, but he has his suspicions, right? Like the whole point of the setup of this film is he's going to wait up in the middle of the night, hide under the dining table. You know, he's going to set cameras up. He wants to find out if there is evidence that Father Christmas does actually exist. And I think it really nails that kind of, that childhood innocence into a kind of cynicism, I suppose. Like you've talked about already, this loss of innocence, I suppose, that this movie nails.
Yeah, and that's such a great conceit to have, because he's like, we want him to remain, you know, with that wonder and awe and hope for Father Christmas, but ultimately it's absolutely just destroyed, and which makes the end of the film just all the more galling. Like, we as people can see the horror in a man coming into the house and, you know, doing what he does, but on top of that, you're literally destroying this kid's entire kind of perception of a festive holiday.
Yes.
Like the one night of the year that he was going to enjoy the most.
Yes.
I feel awful for him.
No, you're right, because actually, like, all it does in a way maybe is solidify the idea that Father Christmas is real, right? Because his mum tells him that that Father Christmas can turn into an ogre if you stay up and see him or something, right? Which is kind of exactly what happens to this kid. So it only kind of emphasizes this idea that this myth is real. And again, I think it's funny that this film kind of, again, makes you reckon with, isn't it weird that adults like have these lies that they tell children as well? Like they make up these myths as well. It's so funny. And like that whole idea of the mum making up that Father Christmas turns into an ogre is, again, pretty dark, isn't it? It's so funny.
Yeah, it's an example of those things that, like, parents, there's white lies that parents tell children thinking, oh, it'll just stop them doing that one thing that's kind of annoying. But actually, it can really influence their psyche and the way they think about stuff. So that, like, oh, right, I'm telling him that he'll turn into an ogre if he sees him, in the hopes that won't stay up and try and see him.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't exist, obviously. But then this stuff happens and it reinforces that horrific image he has and this idea. And, like, it's just gonna require quite a lot of.
He's going to be in a lot of therapy, I think, isn't he?
That's the word. That's it, isn't it? Yeah, he's going to need therapy for a while.
Yes, that is what we all said after I finished watching this. I was watching it with Rihanna and our friend James Payne, who was round as well. We all watched it together. And at the end, we were all like, oof, that kid is going to need some serious therapy at the end of that ordeal. Yeah, for sure. What do you think of, and like this kind of goes hand in hand with what we were saying about the look and vibe of this film, but what do you think of the house? Because again, this is something we've been talking about in all these home invasion films. The house itself is always so important. The geography of the space and the way it's set up. This house is like no other that I've seen so far this series. It's absolutely incredible, isn't it? I loved the design of this house.
It is amazing. It's absolutely massive.
It's ridiculous.
It's got like 1 million turrets. It's 1 billion windows. It's, you know, up and down. It's just massive and imposing. But the way they use it is so clever as well. Like in the start, it's played for kind of jokes. It's kind of funny where Thomas is playing Rambo or whatever, and he climbs out his window and he's shuffling along his windowsill. And then you pulls out and you see he's actually just on like a balcony.
That's so good.
You know, it's so funny. Yeah. And then the way they twist it and suddenly it becomes this kind of nightmarish place with, it's even got a maze inside it. I don't know why you would build a maze inside your own home.
No.
I mean, I do love mazes.
I do.
But to have one in your own home, I suppose you would never expect this kind of thing to happen.
Well, it was weird. It was like a maze of sort of office. Was it like office desks or something? I can't remember now. But like, it's a really weird layout of rooms. And again, it kind of emphasizes this vibe that what we're seeing is a slight skewed perspective from a child, I think, of this house, right? Like, I don't know, it almost feels a bit like what we're seeing is through this little boy's eyes, and so everything is bigger and grander than it would be otherwise, right? Like you say, it's surely no one has a house that big. That it's like a castle, isn't it? It's like a palace, and
complete with suit of armor.
Yes, suits of armor, trap doors. There is not just like, next week, again, talking about the people under the stairs, where that house has a similar vibe where the kids can like crawl inside the wall spaces. But in this, it's not just wall spaces. There's like a whole, like, whatever that is, like a massive like hall in between two rooms where you go through a fridge and end up in this like magical like kids paradise world, right?
Oh,
it's
man.
amazing.
I would have loved that as a kid.
Yeah.
I love a secret passage. I love a drawbridge, whatever that thing was. Like,
love it.
And the fact that he keeps it secret from his mum, I'm not sure how, but that's okay, fine.
Yeah, the fact that the mum doesn't even know that this giant space, which is bigger than my whole house's cross-section in total, is like just hidden away in their room,
Yeah, it's a big old house, but I really like that idea that what we're seeing is a child's impression of it, because everything seems bigger when you're a kid, doesn't it? But like he obviously knows it inside and out, and he's loving the space and what he can do with it, and he knows where to put cameras and all of that. But as soon as this malevolent force enters the house, it becomes something unlike he's ever seen it before, and he gets lost in the maze. And then the Santa Claus jumps up in front of him in the attic. It's a very different space for him, isn't it?
It is so clever, all of that stuff, I think. And you're right. I like the fact that this house is familiar to the boy. The boy knows it better than anyone, even his parents, right? And this is something we'll talk about too with Kevin in Home Alone, that like these kids know the spaces and use them to their advantage over, these people that are invading, which is great. And I love that Thomas is a very like competent character. Like, he doesn't ever do the stupid thing that people do in horror films. Like, he's really smart and resourceful, isn't he?
He's so good at that. There's no way I was like that as an 8-year-old, but I used to love watching those films where your lead character was you, but had like so much more kind of intelligence and room to do these amazing things. It's like a kid's kind of fantasy sort of.
Yes.
I want to be like them.
Yes, exactly that.
And I guess this film really kind of plays with that, because where Home Alone is the kind of embodiment of I am the kid, I can do this. And like I said, I then felt like I could defend my own house. Yeah. This is like completely the opposite, in that he's trying his best, but it's not necessarily going to work.
No, it's not. Also, he's got his poor grandpa to look after as well. This is the other thing that is really sweet / terrifying about this film, is that you genuinely care about all these characters to the point where I was like, I do not want anyone in this film to die. Even the dog, I was like, oh God, the film does an amazing job of actually making you care about all of these characters, I think.
Totally. I was sort of a bit in two minds over the kind of breakfast table scene, where it's like, oh, is this kid just going to be really annoying to his granddad? He's waking him up. He's like, he's just being pretty annoying. But actually, the second that they start interacting, you're like, granddad loves the kid. The kid really cares for his granddad. He knows his ills. He knows how to look after him. And their relationship is just so special. And it's two-way. And yeah, like they build that relationship up so well. I mean, I dare say much, much better than Thomas and his mum.
Yes.
And so you then care for those people when they're being attacked. And okay, it's that kind of thing of, they mention he's diabetic. Well, at some point we're going to need to find some insulin. Like in, we talked about Signs last year. It's like, there's the inhaler. Probably going to need to find an inhaler at some point.
Yeah.
But like,
absolutely.
It's not like they just dropped that trope in. They really let us feel like this character was a person, and it was such a nice relationship to see, to then have it be almost broken apart. Makes the horror, it elevates the horror for sure.
Yeah, Chekhov's diabetes. This is something that I am literally going to be talking about this next week, because with The People Under the Stairs, I'm discussing Panic Room, and I rewatched that, and of course Kristen Stewart also has Chekhov's diabetes in that film too. It's quite a good like race against time device, I think, isn't it? Like, you've got to save somebody's life and get the medicine in time.
Yeah, and it gets the plot going, running.
Yeah. I also love the kids like tech and inventions as well. That he's got this like Apple Watch, but it's an 80s Apple Watch, so it's like this giant silver box on his wrist that he carries around. It's so good.
I'm not sure if that technology existed, but it was fantastic, and there he is, like plugging in all these cables and building all this stuff. I'm like, yeah, kid inventor. He's intelligent. He's not a dweeb. Like he acts out war things, but he also knows how to build computers and cameras and all of that kind of stuff. It's like, this is the ultimate kid.
Again, there was something of this in the 80s, wasn't there? Like kind of kid inventors and kids, doing stuff with computers. I think of like Weird Science and like all those sorts of war games and stuff. And of course, in 1989 as well, another absolute classic, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, which again has that kind of vibe, right? With the kind of literally larger than life house for these children, and the invention's gone wrong, and like the kind of the danger that lurks around every corner for kids in the kind of domestic space, right? But I do, it feels like it fits so firmly within all those kinds of traditions, I think. But,
100%. And I was exactly the same. I was well into the invention stuff in my youth. Can you imagine, though, like watching all those things and then coming across this and thinking, oh, cool, he's even better than Kevin or whoever else. And then like, oh.
Yeah, I was thinking this, and I said this to Rihanna when we watched it. I was like, I'm almost a bit sad that I've only just discovered this film, because I think when I was about 12 or 13, I think this would have been my favourite film of all time if I'd watched it then. Like, it is so... Yeah. It would have ticked all of my boxes, I think, because also I love a Christmas film generally. And like this is Christmas. It's like a kid's adventure movie, but it's also genuinely disturbing as well, which we'll get to. But yeah, it kind of ticks all the boxes. Yeah.
I guess by that time you were probably watching things like Commando and Predator and stuff as well. So you'd even get the references.
Yeah.
But it wasn't available, I think. That's why we haven't been able to see it. Is that right? Like, it was not available for 20 years or something stupid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's again, we're lucky that it's so easy to come by now, because that's right. I don't think anyone was able to get hold of this film for so long. So let's talk about, this is where the real horror comes in, right? But what do we think of this villain, this Santa Claus guy, who I think is absolutely terrifying? What do you think of him?
Agreed, 100%. And I think he's a really kind of complex villain, while at the same time I'm sort of unable to figure out what he is and what his motives are.
Yes.
He's obviously an adult. He knows how to kill people, and he can do it. But he's also got this kind of childlike wonder. You get lots of close-ups of his eyes. And he's like, I don't know if he's homeless or if he's just, a guy maybe with learning difficulties or something.
Yeah.
It's hard to know why he wants to get involved with the kids.
Yes.
But just the pure fact of him wanting to get involved with the kids, puts me on edge.
I know
immediately.
It's done really well, I think, in like upsetting and making us uncomfortable. I think, because you're right. When we first see him and there are all the kids having like a snowball fight, and he is trying to play along, and all the kids like shun him. At that point, I was sort of like, oh, poor guy, because he does seem like maybe a guy who is just maybe mentally unwell or something, right? And was trying to play with the kids, and then of course, it's like, oh no, there is something seriously wrong with this guy. And it is like, it's really hard to know throughout, like you say, what is his MO? What's he actually doing? Like, does he want to be a child and just hang out with the kids? Or is he some sort of predator? Is he a sexual predator? Like, it's really weird, and it's never really explained, is it, all the way through?
No.
Yeah.
It's really not. The only kind of hint we get, I suppose, is at one point he gets Thomas, and he tells him he's it.
Yes.
And now it's his turn. He's going to go and hide.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, so is this all about him wanting to play hide and seek?
Yeah.
If it is, why did he kill the adults and the dog?
Yeah, I know, right? That's it. And I think it is more that side of it. I think it is more that he wants to be a child and wants to play with the kids and then reacts angrily and violently when he can't, right? And it's almost like he wants to punish people who don't let him because he gets fired from the shopping mall by the kid's mum, of course, and then that's what kind of triggers this whole thing. But it is also extremely creepy. What about when the kid is talking to him through this weird, like, 80s internet chat room? Like, what the fuck is this thing?
Yeah. Well, so I had to do some research. I was like, what on earth are they using?
Yes.
Obviously the real name of this film comes from this thing. It's called Minitel. So France had a sort of pre-internet kind of country-based internet teletext kind of thing where people it was like set up and put in everyone's houses by the government for free, and they could book holidays, check their bank balance, and then it kind of grew, and then chat rooms, picked up. And then so in this film, we kind of get like the seedy end of it where people can hack into chat rooms where kids think they're talking to Father Christmas.
It's really I couldn't believe this. Like, it's so ahead of its time. I did not think that anything like this existed in 1989, like an internet chat room like this, No,
it's crazy.
It's amazing. And the fact that it does look like teletext. It looks like CFAX, doesn't it? And what's even weirder is that the kid is using it in his home and the man is using it in like the middle of a station on some computer station thing, just in the middle of this public place, it seems like, it's really strange.
Yeah, well, you never know when you're going to want to check your bank balance. Might be you might get rejected for a train fare.
It's
better double check, move some money around.
Absolutely, actually, I would find that quite useful sometimes. I think it's true, but yeah, like it's a really strange thing. I can't believe that was actually just a thing in France at this point. Amazing.
It was well ahead of its time.
Yeah,
and then of course the internet came in and absolutely demolished it.
Yes, yes,
and now it's basically irrelevant. But very, very cool thing to use as a device in a horror film.
Yeah.
And it just makes this film so specifically French.
Right.
And that's what I love as well. Like, we couldn't be anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely right. And actually, we didn't really mention the Frenchness of this film generally, but there is something very French about the tone of this film, I always think. Like, when I think of some of the most famous French movies, whether it's like, Delicatessen or Amélie or those sorts of movies, like the Jean-Pierre Jeunet movies, there's that kind of childlike quirkiness and wonder about them in the way that this movie has, right? And then, of course, on the opposite end of the spectrum, I think of like New French Extremity and stuff, and how French cinema and Gaspar Noé, and how French cinema also really doesn't pull its punches. And this movie it has all of that going on in that regard, doesn't it? I think
absolutely, yeah, that's so true.
As the movie goes on, we get this big home invasion moment. The dog is killed. And then it is just like the second half of the film is just this sort of cat and mouse, isn't it? Basically, like, how did you find that, the momentum of the film? And did it kind of hold your attention throughout that whole second half when it's just like him being chased by this guy?
Yeah, I quite enjoyed it because it just kind of abandons like spoken word, and it's like, right, we're going to go montage. Now we're going to go slow-mo. Now we're going to do everything, but we're just going to have music. And like, it just carried me along. And I was like, I don't need them to interact other than to like pop up and be scary and be scared. And I was totally with it. I was like, I don't need anything else. I just want to watch this stuff play out.
Yeah.
It's kind of similar in Home Alone as well. Like, once you get to that point of like, right, he's in.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Loved it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It does. You're right about that. Like, it reaches a point where, and again, this almost, I did almost have this thought as to, did that kid actually fall asleep when he's under the table, and is everything after that a dream? I don't think that is the case, but I think there is something dreamlike that happens from that point onwards when the home invasion starts. And you're right, like all the dialogue sort of stops. It becomes like visual storytelling, doesn't it? Like silent storytelling almost. Everything is like slow motion and stylized and montagey. There are times when I could have done with maybe a little bit less slow-mo and a bit more... It felt a little bit like sometimes the director didn't quite know how to execute a certain set piece or scare, and it was just a lot of build-up followed by not much afterwards. Like there's that long, really long moment when the kid puts the grenade on the toy train, and we follow it go all the way along the floor towards the Santa Claus, and then he sends it back all the way back again, and it's a really fun sequence, and it builds and it builds and it builds and it builds, and then it sort of amounts to not much at the end of that, right?
No, I thought you were going to mention another scene, but I really, really like that scene for a few reasons. I thought you were going to talk about the time when he's like setting the trap and he's running his finger along the fish wire or whatever it is, and it just I'm just going to show you this guy running his fingers along the fish wire for like a full minute.
Yeah.
Like, oh, come on. But that scene with the train and the grenade, I loved it. This is like the film encapsulated in one scene. You've got Thomas with his booby traps. He's using a fake grenade as a real grenade. He's using a Christmas ornament or a Christmas toy to execute his plan. And yet the villain of the piece is so struck by this toy, it doesn't go off. So he picks it up and he's like looking at it like, wow, this is so cool. And then he winds it up and it's playing that lovely kind of merry tune, the Christmas song.
Yes.
And he sends it back and he's like, I love this. It's like exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to play, he wanted to have fun. Sends it back and then suddenly it becomes danger because it could then hit Pappy and explode. And you see Thomas really care for his granddad. And he's like, oh no, he's going to die.
Yeah.
And then Father Christmas comes back in and he's like, I found Thomas, I'm going to grab him so he can't get to the grenade. And yeah, okay, the grenade doesn't go off, but like, thank fuck it doesn't go off.
Yes.
I was so into that moment.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And the actual, like, the tension in that moment is really clever. Because again, we care so much about what happens to this kid and his grandpa that it is like, it's a really good, and I didn't know how far the film was going to push it at any given moment, because the sequence where he kills the dog is pretty brutal.
It is,
and I sort of thought at that moment, I was like, I feel like anything could happen in this film. And I was so genuinely unnerved and creeped out by that Santa Claus guy that I just thought, anything could happen in this movie. He could absolutely kill the grandpa at some point. And I really didn't want that to happen. I was like, oh no.
Yeah. Would it be him or the diabetes? I don't know. But two possible outcomes here. Well, multiple outcomes, but two absolute definitive ways that he might die.
Yes. I mean, why did he put the grandpa in that bloody suit of armour as well?
That was amazing. I don't know how he got him in there. The house must be so big that he was like, we've got a good like half an hour before he makes it back down to the main entrance. It's like, I loved it. I loved that. It was comic, wasn't it, really?
It absolutely was. It really was. And do you think the film did a good job of balancing all those tones, making it kind of very childlike and comic-y whilst also, making a legit horror film, I suppose?
I think so, yeah. And it's weird because it really does kind of just turn on a dime. Like, you have that and then you've got the scene where he attacks them in the car.
Oh, yeah.
I just that's proper, like, horror 101, sitting in the car, can't get the car to start, your villain's in the headlights. And for me, that was one of the most effective scenes in the film. He's like properly going for it. They're terrified. It might be an often used scenario, but it always works.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how it does it, how he balances the tone, but yeah, it works so well. And maybe it is just, here's a scene and we'll gradually just float into a sort of montagey bit and float out of it into a funnier scene. And then we'll float past that.
Yeah.
And we'll have a bit of sadness. We'll have a bit of Bonnie Tyler.
Yeah.
We'll have...
Yeah.
I don't know. It is... It's a bonkers film, but I love it.
It's good. It's so much fun. I totally agree with you. And this is something I'm going to ask you about when we get to Home Alone. But do you think as well that the way the parents are depicted in both these films, I find really interesting. And I notice it more as I'm older. It was something I didn't really think about as a kid with Home Alone, which we'll get to. But do you think the film is portraying the mum in any kind of certain light in this film? This kind of businesswoman who is absent on Christmas Eve, maybe is quite money orientated, but also does, how much is she there for her kid and all of that kind of thing? Like, do you think the movie is making any kind of commentary on this kind of like rich family and the way they treat each other?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because she clearly cares for him. She wants him to have all the presents he wants, and she can obviously do that, and she gets people to do that for her, which I guess is that slight remove of like, does she really care? Does she want to be there? And obviously she goes to work on Christmas Eve. But I don't know. She's a single mum. Where the money comes from, I don't know. Maybe the dad's life insurance or something. But she obviously needs to work, and she's in charge of a department store, so she kind of can't not be at work. Maybe it's like touching on that kind of capitalism at Christmas, the need to make money. It's obviously doing it a lot less kind of in your face than Home Alone or later just Christmas films in general.
Yeah, like Jingle All the Way and stuff, these kind of capitalism movies. But yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it's there maybe a tiny, tiny bit if you want to look for it, but I don't think the film really cares too much about that stuff. But the fact that he is this boy with all of the toys he could possibly want, right? He has everything imaginable. He has all these inventions, these gadgets, these amazing rooms filled with stuff. And yet he's very alone at the same time, isn't he? Like, he's left to his own devices to play by himself. He plays imaginary games. He like does these kind of like Rambo things that he makes up in his head almost. And yeah, like I didn't know if the film was kind of doing something with that, about this idea of this slightly absent parent figure maybe, who is just kind of chucking money at this kid and leaving him to it,
Yeah, yes, it's so possible, isn't it? I don't know how much that was thought through, other than to say, like, yeah, he needs to be alone.
Yes.
Otherwise, this isn't going to work.
Yes, indeed. He needs to be home alone, which is a good segue to move on to the next film, I think. But I guess, like, well, maybe we'll talk about this when we talk about Home Alone in terms of the influence that this may or may not have had on it, right? But is there anything else you want to say on Deadly Games before we move on to Home Alone? I mean, is this a movie that you would now sort of recommend as a bit of a Christmas classic for people, do you think?
Well, it's firmly on my Christmas list. I mean, I have now seen it twice this year, so yeah, no, give it a few more months. Hopefully I'll be ready for it again at Christmas, but 100% in the future, this is a Christmas classic. Absolutely love it. It's fun, it's Christmassy, it's scary, it's kind of everything you want in a Christmas horror, and I've seen plenty of shit Christmas horrors.
Yeah, we've watched a lot of them. It's very, very true. Yeah, it's. I agree with you. It's up there for sure as one of the best Christmas horrors. I really loved it, and I would like to watch it again. I would like to screen this film because I think it would look good on the big screen as well, wouldn't it? I think,
totally.
at Christmas time.
I bet it hasn't been done either. Like,
yeah,
that's something for EOH Presents for sure.
I would love to. Maybe double bill it with like. Better Watch Out or something like that as well.
Yeah, sure. Like, yeah.
So
it's
there you go.
Certainly better than that film.
Well, there you go. There you go. So that is Deadly Games from 1989.
Still been saying stuff.
You mean saying stuff?
What if we opened the door but we didn't shut it?
Oh my god, they followed us.
I like him.
They're not gonna stop. They're never gonna stop.
That was a little clip you just heard there from Talk to Me, which for my money is the best horror film of 2023 so far. This is the Brilliant You Australian horror film made by directing duo Danny and Michael Philippou. The film has won over basically everyone that's watched it, critics and audiences. It's absolutely brilliant, and that is one of the many, many movies that we covered on this month's Fresh Blood, which dropped on Patreon earlier this week. For those who don't know, Fresh Blood is our monthly monthly review strand available on Patreon, in which me and my co-hosts Brad Hanson, Becky Dark, Louise Blaine discuss everything fresh and new in the world of horror, from new films in cinemas to new films on streaming to television shows to new releases on physical media and true crime and video games. And we even talk about a few non-horror recommendations each month. And of course, this month we had to discuss Barbenheimer. So Becky, Brad and I discuss our thoughts on the new Chris Nolan film and the new Greta Gerwig film. We also covered a whole bunch of new releases on Shudder and various other bits and pieces. So if you want to get access to that, you simply need to sign up to our Patreon at a $5 per month level. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. $5 per month will get you access to every single Fresh Blood episode, as well as a whole bunch of other bonus episodes. But if you sign up at a $10 level per month, you will also get access to our exclusive mini-seasons, where you'll hear franchise retrospectives and director retrospectives and a whole bunch of other stuff, and you will get access to a new episode every single week. So it's basically like having a whole second Evolution of Horror weekly podcast to listen to. So sign up now, patreon.com/evolution of horror. Everybody who signs up, no matter what tier, will also get a special thank you on the podcast. So speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of July a little thanks. So a big thank you to Amber Howells, Sarah Langlays, Tracy Ann Fulbrook, Jean-Paul Tizisio, MG, JD, Dan Madley, Wendy Adams, Alison Kroll, Diego, Jack, Tiffany Weiss, Stephen Boodk, Elizabeth Church, Megan, Marcel Lapointe, C-Spec Run, Ryan Cordova, Martin Johansson, Adam Foy, Kevin Lovecraft, Shannon Pemberton, William Mumbello, Montez Shamwow, Derek Zeitel, Jared Hornbeck, Kate Fowler, Lily Sanchez, Nathan Clegg, Aaron Curran, Becca Hallam, Chris Short, Caleb Noose, Christina Raab, Ina Makurtacheva, and Michael Green. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up in the month of July. And one more time, if you want to join them and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode as Rob Watts and I discuss the little-known home invasion classic that is Home Alone.
This is it. Don't get scared now.
Merry Christmas, little fella. We know that you're in there and that you're all alone.
Yeah, come on, kid, open up. It's Santa Claus and his elf.
We're not gonna hurt you.
No. Got some nice presents for you.
Be a good little fella now and open the door.
What?
So the extended McAllister family decide to take a Christmas trip to Paris to visit family, accidentally leaving 8-year-old Kevin at home alone. While he starts living it up, eating ice cream and watching awful gangster movies, 2 inept burglars, the Wet Bandits, attempt to rob the McAllister residence. And so it falls on Kevin, by way of brilliantly devised booby traps, to defend the house, ready for his family's return.
Yes.
That's pretty much it, isn't it?
That's lovely. So, you only just discovered Deadly Games this year, but what about Home Alone, Rob? What's your history with Home Alone?
Well, yeah, like I said, it's the film that set me up to not be scared of home invasion.
Yeah.
I've been watching this film every year at Christmas for probably, I don't know, what age was I? Probably about maybe 7 or 8 when I first saw this. So that's a good, 3/4 of my life, maybe more. My maths is terrible. I love it. It's one of my favourite films. You know, you've let me cover now all 3 of my favourite films.
What are your 3 favourite films?
Mulholland Drive, Let the Right One In, and Home Alone.
Of course.
I'm forever grateful that you've let me do this. Never thought I'd actually get to do Home Alone, but love it.
I know. And we've had some cross comments from people. They weren't happy about the fact that we were covering Home Alone on this podcast.
Come on, guys.
But come on. I do think there is something... It's a culturally important home invasion movie, and I genuinely believe that.
There is discussion to be had with this film in amongst everything else that you've talked about. 100%.
And how it relates to horror films too, I think.
That is exactly it. We can discuss how much of a horror film it really is, but it definitely deserves to be in the conversation. This is the film that kind of set me on the path to loving home invasion films. I definitely wouldn't be watching those films I mentioned earlier if it wasn't for Home Alone. Like, I can remember when I was a kid, probably like a year maybe after I first saw Home Alone, we used to get this video van come round to the house to rent films from. The more I've thought about it, the more I feel like that's kind of dodgy in a few ways. I don't know.
It's a bit Deadly Games, if you ask me, but
yeah, a little bit. But yeah, the video van came around one night and my mum was like, what do you want to watch? And I'm pretty sure he had like a terrible selection. It must have been. Mm-hmm. But I said to my mum, like, I love Home Alone. Can we get something like Home Alone? And I remember there were kids' programs like, there was something called Fudge, and then there was the Dennis the Menace film that John Hughes also wrote.
Yes, I remember that.
I was thinking, like, along those lines, something like that. There was a film literally titled Home Invasion.
Oh.
And so I don't know whether it was me or my mum or both of us that settled on it, but we got that. It was not like Home Alone.
Oh, no.
It was like, okay, it's hard to describe. It was basically just a badly made drama thriller about a mum and her kids getting like invaded by these gangsters. I don't know why. It was quite scary. Lots of men with guns. And yeah, it's had an effect on me. I think it set me on the path for home invasion films. It certainly didn't detract from Home Alone and all of that. So
this is brilliant. Yeah. I've looked it up. So this is Home Invasion from 1997, right?
Yes,
a mother-daughter duo must outsmart a group of robbers who barge into their home.
See, that sounds very much like Home Alone to me.
Yeah, it does. It really does.
It's not, but yeah, great stuff. Did its job. And it's Home Alone that I've got to thank for that.
I love this. Well, I absolutely love this film too. It has been a favourite of mine. Yeah, probably similar to you since I was about 6 or 7 years old. You know, both of us were 90s children, right? And I think like it is absolutely the Christmas film for those of us that grew up in the 90s, probably. Like, you know, I love Elf, but for me, Elf came out just beyond that time, you know, when I was a teenager. And, you know, I've since gone back and fallen in love with kind of older classics like It's a Wonderful Life or whatever. But for me, Home Alone will always be the greatest Christmas film ever made, I think.
Yeah,
I think
totally
it's just
with
perfect. And it is... What is interesting about it is that I remember when I first watched it, and my parents reminded me of this the other day. I saw my parents and I mentioned that I was going to be talking about Home Alone, and they were like, "Oh my god, you were obsessed with that film." Apparently I watched it, you know, like weekly all year round when I when I first got my hands on the VHS of it. But they said to me that initially I was very, very scared of it, or I was scared to watch it.
Okay.
I was only about 7. I don't really remember this, but apparently I was very freaked out by even the video cover of the VHS of Macaulay Culkin screaming with these two like robbers lurking behind him. I think, you know, which is quite a funny poster when you look at it now, obviously. And, you know, Macaulay Culkin, that famous shot of him with his hands on his cheeks and he's screaming. But I think in my little child brain, I thought that was some genuine screaming there of a child in danger. And I thought the film looked absolutely terrifying, you know, when I first glanced at it.
Totally get it. Yeah, totally get it. But it's funny, isn't it, how that image became the kind of the picture you always see of Home Alone, because that has literally nothing to do with the Wet Bandits. That's him putting on aftershave.
Yeah, it's like a stupid throwaway gag, isn't it, in the middle of the film? Yeah.
So funny.
So true.
Like, so not what it looks like on that cover.
And I also love Lost in New York too. Like I will double bill both these films on an annual basis. You know, I think the second one is much more of a kind of overt comedy than the first one, but I love them both. So
that's so interesting you said that, because I was thinking how Lost in New York is kind of more of a horror film.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Because I don't know, this might relate kind of into Deadly Games and this kind of loss of innocence thing, where like Kevin's had to go through this, you know, what in real life would be a pretty traumatic experience. Like,
yes.
People trying to invade your home. He's like really seriously injuring them. And then in the second film, whether it's because he's like, something's clicked in his brain, but the kind of traps in the second film are so much more deadly and so kind of psychopathic almost. Like he knows he wants to inflict injury. He's not just trying to defend a house. Like the house is totally empty. He's like just lobbing bricks and bollards at them.
Yes, actually, and speaking of kids that need to go into therapy, like this kid is like red flag central, isn't it? In terms of how much joy he gets from causing pain to these adults, but it's so satisfying to watch. But you're right, there is an element of the second one is more violent, and there is definitely a moment in the second one that I've used to find scary when he walks through Central Park at night and all the weirdos come up to him at night, right? But also it's so much more over the top and cartoony, and you've got like Tim Curry and all of the group of
the hotel
stuff and Rob Schneider and everything as well. But yes, I think both of them do like sort of juggle elements of horror, and obviously both of them have extreme violence in them as well, which I love. I guess the violence is not so much horrific violence because it's played for laughs. It's almost like you're watching Tom and Jerry, right? That's what it feels like to me.
Slapstick animation stuff, isn't it? But live action and with like actually amazing actors.
Yeah, exactly.
It is. I find it hard. I can't be the guy who says Home Alone is a horror film.
No.
Because it's not. It is, and it was made for us as kids, and I can't break out of the mold of seeing it as this fun kind of, look at what happened to those guys kind
absolutely.
of thing.
Yeah.
I can see how it could be and how it has been influenced. But for me, this is just a fun kind of comedy.
Oh, totally. Yeah. It is. Yeah. And obviously, I'm not actually arguing that this is a horror film. Like I know that I can be pretty liberal with the term horror. I don't think The Home Alone is a horror film. However, I think it's interesting to talk about in the context of home invasion, because how often do you get a home invasion movie that is aimed at kids that is as commercially popular as this? And I think it's interesting that it came out a year after Deadly Games, and that it may or may not have really been influenced by this horror film. So I want to talk about this movie not in isolation, but in relation to Deadly Games and other home invasion films. For example, let's start off by talking about Kevin McAllister, the main character here, this child star played by Macaulay Culkin, of course. How do you think he compares to Thomas from Deadly Games?
Well, they're pretty similar. They're the same age. They sort of have this precociousness, this intelligence that seems kind of beyond their years. Obviously, Kevin doesn't have this kind of computer whiz stuff going on. I think the key distinction between the two films is that Thomas is very much embedded in this world of technology and traps, whereas it's all kind of improvised on Kevin's part. Yeah, which in a way does make it a little bit more concerning that he's been able to just devise this stuff off the top of his head. Whereas Thomas is he's watched these films and he's got this infrastructure in place to have fun. Whereas Kevin is just like, right, what's the worst thing I can do to get rid of these guys? But they're both like, for 8-year-old me, kind of heroes almost.
Yeah, totally. They absolutely are. Kevin McAllister is a proper hero, isn't he? So well played by Macaulay Culkin, he is. There's something kind of, he's a little psychopath, I think, actually, isn't he? But I think there's something kind of aspirational about him in a way, right? That he's so capable when he's left on his own. He's so capable of looking after himself, of defending himself, of knowing exactly what to do when these burglars come in. It's so good.
He's so funny. And the thing with this, I guess it's the screenplay by John Hughes, but like, he talks to himself, but he's kind of breaking the fourth wall.
Absolutely.
But there's that kind of talking out loud. You hear the way his mind is thinking. He's like, I'm in this situation, so I need to do this, that, and this. I need to brush my teeth. I need to, all that kind of...
Yes.
And there's a reason Macaulay Culkin was like the most in-demand child star for those sort of 5 years, because he's incredibly talented. Like, he's definitely a better actor than Thomas, not detracting anything from... what's his name? Alan Mousset's performance, but it's just a brilliant performance from Macaulay Culkin. Yeah,
it's one of the all-time great child performances, isn't it? One that will almost so big that he almost can never now be an actor as an adult without people making jokes about him as Kevin McAllister, basically, right? Like, he will always be that child star now, I think,
Yeah, like, he went away for so long, and, like, he's just re-emerging, and still, it's like, yeah, well, it's Macaulay Culkin from Home Alone. It's not, it's Macaulay Culkin from the most recent series of American Horror Story or something, is it? Like,
Exactly. Yeah, that's the problem. And all of the Culkins, I kind of love them all, because obviously we've got little Kieran Culkin here, aka
Kieran.
Roman Roy, right? As well. So, like, incredible to see him in this as Little Fuller.
I've got a trivia question for you, actually, on that subject. So, yeah, we've got Kieran Culkin, but who is the other Succession actor who is also in Home Alone?
Oh, this is good.
I know, I thought you might like this.
I'm just having a think through the cast. So, Joe Pesci, Daniel Stern, Catherine O'Hara, John Hurd, none of them are in Succession at any point, are they?
No, they don't turn up.
I don't know. Who else is it?
It's Hope Davis, the French air steward, at the airport when Catherine O'Hara is desperate to get back.
Yes.
It's Hope Davis that she speaks to. And Hope Davis, of course, plays... oh, my God. I can't remember.
Oh, my God, yes. Sandy. Sandy's daughter, Sandy.
That's it. Sandy's daughter, Sandy.
That's amazing. I did not know that. That's brilliant. Wow. There you go.
Connections everywhere.
It does have a great cast, doesn't it? And actually, funnily enough, this is the second podcast together where we've talked about Catherine O'Hara, right? Because we've talked about Beetlejuice together before on this podcast. Yeah. You're the official...
early 90s.
Yeah, you're the official spokesperson for all Catherine O'Hara films covered on this film.
She is amazing, isn't she?
Oh, she is, along with Kevin, she's the star, right, of this movie and of the second movie too. Like, I just think she's phenomenal.
She's so good, and she's not really in it. And every time you see her, she's like desperately trying to get back to her kid. And it's the performance of a mother regretting something she's done and just desperate to see her children again. Like, it's not even a comedic performance. This is a full-on dramatic role that Catherine O'Hara is playing. And it's amazing. I was recently on a US trip, and I went to New York, and I have to go to Rockefeller Center. It's not Christmas.
Yes.
There won't be a tree, but I still got there, and I got goosebumps from that reunion scene in the second film.
Yeah.
The two of them together, they're so good, and they're not even together for most of the film's runtime.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, she and John Hurd's character, Peter and Kate McAllister, they're not the best parents, are they? Let's be honest. And she is. No. She sends her kid up to the attic for misbehaving, and basically just doesn't bother checking on him again, and goes on holiday and forgets him. Right? She's not Mother of the Year, I think.
No, I mean, it's pretty harsh sending him up to the attic when all he's done is ask for pizza, and they've his older brother's being a dick. It's. I mean, talk about the villains of the piece. We've got the wet bandits, but in that moment when Kevin ends up getting sent to the attic, Uncle Frank is probably the most villainous person in the film, right?
Oh, Uncle Frank is evil.
Look what you did, you little jerk.
Yeah, he's a real dick, isn't he? That's the thing. And yes, I think there is something funny. Like, again, when I watch it as an adult, there are funny things I notice, in which they are really painting these adults as monsters. I mean, Uncle Frank, definitely, overtly, a horrible human being, right? And then the parents, when they all, the adults all put themselves in first class on the plane.
Oh, yeah.
And they put all the kids in coach.
They're like, should we have done that? And they just wave it off yeah, they'll be fine.
So funny. There is,
it's so good.
Again, there is something there hidden in this movie a bit about this kind of capitalism, right? And these kind of these kind of slightly greedy American family, right? They're quite in some ways they're quite grotesque. I think this American family at the beginning and the way they're portrayed.
Yeah, for this film definitely nails that on their head.
Yeah.
Unlike, I said, Deadly Games not so much, but this, even at the start when no one wants to pay for the pizza, there's about 20 of you. You've all obviously got plenty of money. Look at the size of your house. Yeah. You're going to France for Christmas. Just someone pay the pizza boy.
Yeah.
And Uncle Frank again just being like, nah, and
funny.
Yeah.
It is definitely in there, isn't it, I think, which I found really funny. And it's the most gorgeous, massive house as well. Now, obviously, this isn't a house like the Deadly Games one. It isn't like this mystical castle. But what a house, right? I used to watch this as a kid and be like, oh my God, imagine living in this home. It's absolutely incredible. Yeah.
I read that it took them forever to find this house, like, as a location. Mm-hmm. And when John Hughes and Chris Columbus finally saw it, they're like, well, yeah, that's definitely it. It didn't take any more scouting. It's like, well, this is the house. And it is a beautiful house. And it's like you were asking about, what makes a good kind of Christmas horror. Well, what makes a good Christmas film is a beautifully decorated house.
Yes.
And the central location of this film is an amazing, beautifully decorated Christmas house, isn't it? It's almost like a gingerbread house.
It is, absolutely. It goes back to that idea of fairy tales, doesn't it? It's like a fairy tale house, absolutely. And again, these kind of it's a lot more kind of grounded, but there is something again about this house being quite vast and having different kind of almost passageways and stuff. Like there's like a laundry chute that goes down to the cellar. There's a kind of basement access down some steps, and there's different kind of little cubby holes and ways in and out of this house, isn't there, as well, which kind of is really brilliantly handled by Chris Columbus, I think.
That's my childhood dream. I still love anything with a secret passage, anything with like a, when you're going, they didn't have one in this film, sadly, but like a door that's behind a bookcase or something.
Yes.
I'm sold. I'm in. And this house is like, the dream kind of children's playground. Again, like Thomas and Kevin have got it made.
Yeah.
Like he's got all the stuff he could ever want and a place in which to kind of act it all out. Like he's got a tree house.
Oh my God.
He's got...
I know.
He's just got everything.
That awesome zip line that goes from the window to the treehouse as well. It's so fucking cool.
Oh, imagine that. Like growing up, like our parents could never do what, the ultimate thing that we would want. I never got a treehouse. I got a Wendy house. It's like, it's all right, but it's not connected to my bedroom window, is it?
Exactly, right? Oh, I know. If only. Talk about aspirational, this kid and his life, right? Unbelievable. Let's talk about it in relation to Deadly Games then, because I think that so this movie came out 1 year after Deadly Games, right? There are obviously so many similarities. They deny that they knew anything about Deadly Games when they made Home Alone, which could well be true, to be fair, right? But, supposedly René Manzor did threaten to sue them in terms of just how many similarities there were. He actually accused Home Alone of being like a remake of Deadly Games. What do you think? What are your thoughts on this?
I struggle with this. Like, it really isn't the same film.
No.
It does have a similar conceit, and Deadly Games is kind of less focused on out and out showing the booby traps. Like, we see them, but they're kind of mostly done in that montage kind of way. Whereas here it's like, we get to a point, the Christmas music, the church turns on a dime. It goes straight into the kind of action, dum 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 dum, and then suddenly we're like, right, set piece.
Yes.
So I don't think they're quite the same thing, and I struggle to see how John Hughes would have actually known about this film to write something so similar.
Well, that's for me that's the biggest thing, right? I can see those similarities. You're right. I mean, tonally and stylistically, they're quite different. Deadly Games is so weird, isn't it? And it's dark and it's twisted and it's aimed at adults, but it's also got that kind of weird European film thing where it's a bit of a mishmash of tones. Whereas this is so Hollywood. It's so straight down the line kids movie for Christmas. But just the fact that, I guess it's just the story itself, the fact that it is a little boy alone in the house at Christmas and then his home is invaded by some dangerous adults. And he does set some booby traps. You're right, there's a bit less emphasis on the booby traps in Deadly Game, but I guess it's that same thing of the kid defending his own house. And there are similarities, like you said, in the characters of Kevin and Thomas. Like, there are parallels, but it's hard to know, isn't it? That could absolutely just be coincidental, I think. Well, this sort of thing happens.
Like we said, it wasn't ever released in America. So what are the chances that John Hughes were able to see it? I mean, I did do a fair bit of reading around this, and I kind of come down on the side that he couldn't possibly have logistically actually have seen the film in time to write his own version and then film it and release it the following year.
Yeah.
I know it was quite a quick kind of production in the end, but I don't think so. I think John Hughes was certainly was script based more than I want to make a film about a home invasion. He claims to have left his child at home at one point. It's oh, there's a good way into a film. What would happen if he was left at home? And then you build on that. Whereas it feels like Deadly Games was very much it's a home invasion Christmas film.
Yes.
So, yeah. Difficult to know. Plenty of similarities. And I suppose we won't ever know, but for the director of Deadly Games to out and out tell everyone he thinks it's an absolute rip-off, I'm not so sure.
No, and we'll probably never know, but I think it's just a really interesting, fascinating parallel here because, yes, you've got two movies that narrative-wise are almost the same, but look at how differently they're handled. You can shift the tone slightly and it can push something that goes from horror into slapstick comedy, right? And I think it's a really interesting case study in how different directors can balance tones and how you can switch genres, within the same framework. So both of these movies are about children at Christmas. Both of them are about, dangerous men breaking into the house on Christmas Eve. Both of them are about these boys that can't rely on adults. Their parents are absent, so they have to come up with inventive ways to protect themselves and defend their own home. And it's just that both of them are handled very differently.
And they do make a great double bill, it has to be said.
They do.
It works brilliantly. I don't know, you could do it either way around as well. It could be Christmas Eve maybe, with your kids, watch Home Alone at 7:00. That finishes. They go to bed ready for Father Christmas. You grab your eggnog
Yes.
and settle in for murderous Father Christmas.
Yeah, you pop this on at 10, 11 o'clock at night. Oh, yeah, I agree. It's great stuff. Let's talk about the Wet Bandits then. Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern. Again, obviously, very much written for kids' films, these characters, as opposed to, the creepy, possibly paedophilic Santa Claus in Deadly Games. But what do you think of these two?
They're brilliant, aren't they? It's a film that's kind of slapstick and cartoon, but they cast the perfect people to really give them that kind of sinister edge.
Yes.
Casting a good fella, a gangster, you don't get much more kind of genuinely frightening, could mash your head in if he wanted to, person than Joe Pesci. So it kind of makes that element of the film far scarier than it could possibly have been. It's not like Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner. It's Roadrunner and Joe Pesci.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right, because this came out the same year as Goodfellas, right? So at Christmas, obviously. So audiences will have just watched Goodfellas that year, and Joe Pesci be one of the scariest, most threatening characters of all time in cinema history, right? And it's genius. Great. I mean, I just love that he decided to do this movie too, actually, because as we know, famously, Joe Pesci doesn't do a huge amount of roles. He doesn't do a huge amount of acting. He kind of picks and chooses his roles quite carefully, and I love that he wanted to do this, and he is brilliant in it, isn't he? He's so funny.
That's the thing. It's that thing of taking someone who's known for playing it dead straight and putting them in a comedic role, but playing it dead straight.
Yes.
The only thing he doesn't really do is actually knife Kevin or swear. Otherwise, he's basically the same kind of person. Everything is that little bit heightened.
Yeah.
Who'd have thought that he'd have such great kind of slapstick action chops?
So good. And Daniel Stern makes me laugh so much he's so
Absolutely.
funny, and particularly at the physical stuff in that final
An
act.
all-timer.
Yeah.
I don't even know how he does some of it. The sliding on the steps on the ice and then hooking himself on and for me, there's so many moments that I just cry with laughter at. But the scene when he puts the spider on his face.
Oh, it's incredible. It's so funny. You're right. But also, it's when you listen to that scream in isolation, it's an incredible scream, right? that could be a sound from a horror movie. That could be a scream from a violent horror movie.
I love it. It's like they are threatening, but you put a spider any near one of them and suddenly they're just the opposite.
Yeah. And I think, we haven't really talked about John Hughes and Chris Columbus, right? But like, Chris Columbus does a good job too of making this film about as violent as it can possibly be, and yet still keep that kind of U certificate, I suppose, right? Because it is mental how much these guys go through. The broken glass, the iron to the face, the blowtorch, the paint cans. It's really nasty, like verging on body horror, what these two go through, right? But it's handled so well.
Completely. Like, I wonder whether you could get away with quite that much now. The only thing doesn't really show is blood. Like, you've got...
I think that's what it is, yeah.
Yeah. Like, you got that searing pain on the hand. You got the head being torched. Just an iron... Yeah, the iron to their face. Like, you know, I know Better Watch Out kind of amplifies it and references Home Alone and all of that. But these things... in a real, you know, if it was real, they would do a lot more damage than we see. But Chris Columbus films them in such a way that they absolutely look like they're being clobbered and that it would actually hurt.
Yes.
But then the kind of effects, they're just kind of verging on cartoony for you to kind of give it a kind of, comedic tone.
I think it's the sound effects that play a big part in it, right? That they are cartoony sound effects, like the dong of like an iron hitting the face, or like, I don't know, if there was an adult version of this, it would be like squelchier and crunchier, you know, when an iron hits you in the face. And I think there's something about, it's the combination of Pesci's and Stern's performances are a little bit larger than life, and also the sound design is just very funny, and it softens that violence, I think, doesn't it? Yeah.
Heads up! Don't worry, Marv, I'll get him for you.
That scene when they get hit in the face with paint cans, where it's like, ding, ooh, and the music's kind of comedic, right? You mentioned Better Watch Out already. Like that, for anyone who hasn't seen it, Better Watch Out is a 2016 movie. It's a great little nasty horror film, right? And it's playing on the tropes of Home Alone. It's like a boy alone at Christmas and violence ensues. I won't spoil too much about it because it's so much fun. But there is a scene where they overtly reference Home Alone, right? And a boy throws a paint can down the stairs and it hits somebody in the face. But that is done in a serious way, and it actually shows the real violent effects of what could happen. And when you compare that kind of dunk noise in Home Alone to the sound that the paint can makes in Better Watch Out, for example, it's much squelchier. So I just think it's interesting in a way that is, you know, we talk about the point of this podcast is it's the evolution of horror, right? And that there are these interesting cinematic references to Home Alone in horror movies. Next week, we're going to talk about The People Under the Stairs. And again, Home Alone is going to come up as quite a big parallel movie there. And it's just fascinating to me how Home Alone has some of the same violence that you see in some of these other nasty horror movies, but you just push it that little bit further, right? And that tone is completely different.
Completely. I think, for instance, there's the scene with the nail in the floor. We've seen that in a horror film since.
Right, A Quiet Place. Yeah.
They both play out in much the same way. Mm-hmm. Daniel Stern, he steps on it, lets out one of the best squeals of all time, and then he falls flat back on his face to the bottom of the stairs. All you have to do to make that a little bit kind of more horror is change the scream.
Yeah.
Maybe show the nail going through his foot.
Yeah.
Change the way he falls or something. Like, it's not a big difference, is it?
No, you're so right. And even showing it, the nail going to the foot, you don't necessarily need to do. I mean, there is literally more on-screen violence in Home Alone than there is in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like, that is funny, right?
That is a sentence.
Yeah. But I think I find that really fascinating, right? The difference in how filmmakers like can create, just how different violence can look on different films depending on just like different techniques you use, and how it can go from being extremely uncomfortable or grotesque to being just really funny. And it's amazing. Home Alone is such a good example of that, I think.
You guys give up, or you're thirsty for more?
And I think you need the character of Kevin, too, as somebody that's smart and brave and doesn't get too scared. I think that's the other reason why this film is... you can handle it as a kid, right? If this kid was actually... a bit like in Deadly Games, that kid actually gets scared and he cries and he screams out for help, and that makes it more troubling,
so
right?
sad,
Whereas Kevin never does that. Like, he is cool and calm and collected, and therefore, as a kid, I think you don't feel so scared for that reason.
Yeah, 100%. He does show his vulnerability a little, just enough for us to care that we don't want him to actually get harmed.
Yeah.
But you're right. He's totally kind of, once he gets over that initial, someone's trying to get in, and he hides under the bed. Once he's over that, he's like, okay,
exactly.
I'm into action mode now.
Because actually, the point that I used to find scary in this film is the one thing that Kevin finds scary, which is the shoveling snowman, right? Like, he's of course not a threat at all, but because Kevin sees him as a threat, that actually is one of the more creepy moments in the film, isn't it? I think
totally. And like the little story they give, that's genuinely, an older brother definitely would tell that to a younger brother, like properly scary story about a murderer who hides his bodies in the salt bins. Like, fucking hell, guys. And I guess that sort of sets the tone for the film a little bit. But in Kevin's mind, he's like suddenly already on edge of this guy just round the corner.
Yeah.
And he's not the one to be scared of at all.
Exactly. Of course, he comes in and saves the day in the end, doesn't
Love
he?
it.
As well, which is great.
Yeah, so in Deadly Games, we have Grandad and Thomas. And in this, you have a somewhat similar thing of the neighbour and Kevin. But it's like, if these films didn't have that kind of emotional engagement, like the really well-written engagement between the child and the adult, then I'm not sure that the horror or the violence would pay off as well.
No, exactly. And I think this is something, and we've talked about this together before, about kids' horror and, has horror kind of softened for kids in recent years compared to when we were growing up in the 80s and 90s and stuff, right? But there is this idea that obviously, like, in some ways it is any child's biggest fear, being left alone without your parents, like unattended. This fear of abandonment is like the most primal, I would say, fear for children, isn't it? Like getting left alone in the supermarket or getting left alone at home. It plays on your absolute worst fear that kind of, is kind of inherent in everyone. But again, this film handles it in such a way that it makes it kind of cathartic and celebratory, which is really fun.
That's it, isn't it? Yeah, we've all been there in the supermarket. Like, sometimes it resolves in a funny way. Like, I remember getting lost in Children's World once, thinking I'd found my dad, ran up to him, slapped him on the bum. Wasn't my dad.
Amazing. Yeah, classic.
But, that, again, it was funny, but also terrifying. I've just hit a man I don't know, and I don't know where my family are.
Yeah.
So and for like, however old he is, 8 years, he's been surrounded by the comfort blanket of a family, and then suddenly doesn't have it.
Yeah.
And that there is a threat. Like, it plays that fear so well.
It does it really well, and it goes through these waves of like, holy shit, my family have disappeared, to, oh my God, amazing, my family have disappeared, to then like going through that roller coaster of emotions, and then eventually getting to that really sad point when he's like, okay, I really want my mum back now, kind of thing. And then the moment that will always kind of choke me up, which is when the mum comes home at the end, right? Like, it's a kind of amazing, beautiful moment, that moment, every time I watch it,
John Hughes, I know he didn't direct this, but he writes such, I don't know how, but he writes those kind of reconciliation scenes so beautifully.
Yes.
I think maybe it's like to do with how much time that he gives them to kind of accept the situation, because when mum comes home, like, they don't see each other straight away. They're in different rooms. They're kind of looking around. It's like got very quiet, and it's all very twinkly, and then that reunion happens, and it's just like, I don't know, it just builds so nicely, and it's similar at the end of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles as well, which is again one of my favourites. Not actually Christmas, a Thanksgiving film, but festive favourite.
Absolutely.
But he writes that, and John Candy's character in that, when Steve Martin finally realizes that, spoiler alert for Planes, Trains and Automobiles, that John Candy's wife has died, and he invites him to his house and he meets the family. It's like, I don't know how you've managed to just destroy me in like one moment, but it works every time.
Completely agree. It's a really like understated moment in Home Alone that is actually one of the most beautiful moments in the whole film, I think, isn't it? It's so good. Yeah. Well, there you go. That's Home Alone, really, isn't it? Is there anything else you want? I mean, I know this is probably a film you could probably go on about for another couple of hours, Rob, but is there anything else that we've missed? Anything major that you want to mention?
I mean, not really. I'm not going to quote the film for you again. It's just, it's just the perfect thing. Like being scared of the basement, but then Kevin overcomes his own fear of the basement. And then he even tells... Who is it he tells that he was scared of the basement? But actually, I then realised that if I just manned up a little bit and said it's fine, that it would be okay. It wasn't really going to harm me. I think it's just so good at kind of, there is a threat, but it's okay because our main character understands and overcomes it, and he explains how he overcomes it as well.
Although genuinely disturbing when they catch Kevin at the end and hang him on a hook, and Joe Pesci goes, "I'm going to bite off each one of his fingers."
That's true.
That's a fucking weird thing for John Hughes to have written, isn't it?
I wonder if he improv that then. I wonder. Yeah. That's so true. Like, wow. Oh my God. That is like full on. I don't know. Yeah, it's like, what could you possibly say at that moment to make a hit round the head even more deserved?
Yes.
That's it,
exactly
isn't it?
That. Exactly that. So good.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up, let me quickly ask you about the sequels of Home Alone, because, of course, we've talked a little bit about Home Alone 2, which in my head is the only kind of canon sequel, right?
Agreed.
Which is like, all the same characters, Kevin McAllister a year later. But what do you think of everything else that came sort of after the original Home Alone?
Well, obviously in the 90s, I wasn't like some sort of Home Alone fanboy.
Yeah.
So I just saw Home Alone 3 when it came out as a fun film. It's like, yeah, I like the other Home Alones. I'll probably like this. And, it's a perfectly fun kids movie. I like the fact that it kind of builds in a bit of technology, like, nearly 10 years after Deadly Games, but it does do it.
It does, yeah.
I didn't mind that it wasn't Kevin. That's fine. It's got a good kid. He was maybe a little bit more annoying than Macaulay Culkin, but as a film, I think it was fine. It was good adventure stuff. I've seen it a few times since. Perfectly good. Getting much further away from sort of scary home invasion, much more played for kind of slapstick. You've got the villains are very caricatured, aren't they?
Very. I think that's what really lets that movie down is the performances, right? Like the kid isn't as good as Kevin. The burglars, the baddies definitely aren't as good as Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern. That's for sure. Yeah.
No, and Raja Gosnell, who edited the first two films, steps up to director. Great. You aren't Christopher Columbus, though, are you, unfortunately? No. So it doesn't have those same flourishes. The action's not done in the same way. It is an inferior sequel, fine.
Yeah.
And I'm fine with that. That's okay. What comes after that?
Home Alone 4, but I've never seen it.
Which one is... do you have the subtitle?
Hang on, let's
Home Alone 4.
Have a look. Home Alone 4, 2002... Mike Weinberg as Kevin McAllister. Oh, Kevin McAllister. A 9-year-old boy who defends his house from Marv and Vera. So what? It's kind of like a reboot. I've not seen this, but it looks...
I think I've seen this one.
Yeah.
I think, essentially, you've got a kid who looks nothing like Kevin McAllister,
yes,
but is Kevin McAllister, in a totally different house. Marv, not played by Daniel Stern. It's basically just like they've gone, let's do the first film with the recognizable names and stuff, try and update it to like a kind of more technology-centered house, and it is just utterly shit. Everything about it is shit.
Yes. Yeah, it sounds pretty bad. There's Home Alone The Holiday Heist from 2012, which
I don't think I saw that.
No, a made-for-television Christmas comedy film directed by Peter Hewitt. It looks... I mean, it's just all the same shit, isn't it, basically, but just not as good as the original by the looks of it.
Yeah.
And then there was another one as well, Home Sweet Home Alone from 2021.
Yeah, I did see that.
Did you?
Mostly because it has Rob Delaney in it, and it has the Irish comedian who's brilliant.
Oh yeah, it's got Aisling B in it. Yeah,
Aisling B, that's it, of course. It's I don't know. It's a made for Disney Plus thing. Like it doesn't look or feel like a proper film, which is what the first two films do. And the kid is just a horrible person. I don't like him. He's far too annoying and just no.
Well, I
would not recommend.
Well, this is the thing, right? Like, so often I find films that star children quite annoying and unwatchable, right? And it's very rare to get two films like these two, Deadly Games and Home Alone, where children can entirely kind of carry a movie, right? And that's the case with both these films, I think. You know, like, I think both of them do an amazing job in that regard.
100%. There's a reason that we know Macaulay Culkin's name. I don't know about Alan Moosey, but yeah, I mean, he was the director's son, so that probably helped quite a lot in terms of his performance and feeling comfortable. But yeah, you can't recreate those sorts of performances.
No, you absolutely can't. It's so good, isn't it? Two iconic performances in two iconic movies. Well, there we go. Rob, that's it. We've done it. Before we wrap up, my final question for you. What is your favourite home invasion movie?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I love them, but I don't tend to go back and watch them regularly. You know, they're pretty brutal. But I think when you mentioned you were doing this series, the first one that came to mind, because I had such an intense experience watching it, was The Purge.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of that original Purge, which is 100% just a home invasion film.
Yes.
Loved it. So I'd probably say that, if not Hard Candy, which I bought on the spur of the moment when I was in Virgin Megastore once because the cover looked cool. And Elliot Page's performance is just remarkable.
Unbelievable. Yeah. And Patrick Wilson, of course, as well, isn't it?
Of course. It's an all-timer, that one. Love it.
Absolute all-timer. I completely agree with you. Yeah. Both amazing movies. I'm excited to rewatch The Purge, actually. It's been a long time. And those movies have kind of got a bit out of hand with all the sequels. But that original one, like you say, that kind of stripped back home invasion was a really creepy concept. It was really good. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the idea that you've got this incredible worldwide event thing happening, but you're just focusing on one home. Obviously, it was going to lead to sequels, and some of them are pretty good.
So, yeah, not bad. Well, there you go. Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining me. It's been such a joy, and I feel very Christmassy now. I might just go make myself a little mince pie or something, or a mulled wine.
Do it and stick on some Bonnie Tyler.
Yes, exactly. Let's do it. It's perfect. But until next time, let people know where they can find you out there online.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Threads.
Of course.
Has everyone moved to Threads yet?
Yeah, kind of. I've not really used it much, but I have technically moved over to it. Yes.
Well, when we're all on there, I'm there. So we're at RobWatts88. I have a podcast, an Icelandic cinema podcast called Kvikmyndapod, which is KVIKMYNDAPOD. That's on Twitter, Instagram, Threads. And we have a new episode dropping now, I think. So please come and give us a listen. We're on all the podcast platforms.
Amazing. Rob, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. This has been so much fun.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you to this week's brilliant guest, Rob Watts. So let me know what you thought of this week's episode. I'm waiting for the angry emails to come in. And let me know what you thought of this week's films, Deadly Games and Home Alone. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, etc. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, which you can find on Facebook. You can also join the Evolution of Horror Discord. If you want access to weekly bonus episodes and more, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as this really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then, and I promise, next week it's a little bit more horror focused. Next week we've got 2 insanely fun home invasion horror movies, both by absolute masters of their craft. Next week I'm going to be joined by Michael Blythe to discuss a Wes Craven movie and a David Fincher movie. We're going to be discussing The People Under the Stairs from 1991 and Panic Room from 2002. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.